I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is moving to expand its regulatory domain by adding oversight of certain diagnostics it does not regulate today. The agency says thousands of these tests are used daily to guide treatment decisions and diagnose disease, and it wants to ensure their validity and advance personalized medicine. We spoke to Nathan Beaver, a partner with Foley Lardner, about the FDA's efforts, the implications for diagnostics companies, and why the agency's plans are being met with some resistance from industry and Congress. Nate, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Danny.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is moving toward regulating so-called LDTs, laboratory-developed tests, a move it says will encourage the development of personalized medicine by helping to ensure the reliability of certain diagnostic tests. Let's start with LDTs themselves. What's the difference between an LDT and other diagnostic? What constitutes whether a diagnostic is an LDT?
Sure, that's a great question. Let me begin actually by talking about an in vitro diagnostic. Let's start with that because an LDT is essentially a subset of that. But an IVD is, from an FDA perspective, treated as a device where FDA defines a medical device as an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, or in vitro reagent, which is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals. Within that context of what is an IVD, FDA has defined the term laboratory-developed test, or more commonly known as LDTs these days, as an IVD that's intended for clinical use and that is designed, manufactured, and used within a single laboratory. So really the key aspect of that is FDA considers an LTD to be an in vitro diagnostic device that's used within a single laboratory and was created by a single laboratory.
Why haven't these tests been regulated historically?
Well, they have been regulated historically from the sense that FDA has always had jurisdiction over these types of devices, not only IVDs but LTDs. However, for the past 20 or 30 years, FDA has taken a very hands-off approach with respect to these devices, using what in the legal world we would call enforcement discretion, essentially meaning that FDA has asserted jurisdiction but has not placed any requirements on manufacturers of LDTs to actually comply with what normally a manufacturer of a medical device would have to go through, which includes things like registration and listing with FDA, either obtaining approval or 510K clearance for those types of devices. And in the past, none of those requirements have been placed on LDT manufacturers or labs that use them.
Well, I may have misspoke a moment ago. The Centers for Medicaid Services regulates LDTs under the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, or CLIA Act. How will this change things for diagnostic makers if FDA steps in and says we're going to regulate these now?
Sure, and you're right to say that it's not as though there has been no oversight of LDTs before, and that was of course, one of the reasons as well that FDA felt comfortable for a very long time in taking the position that there was sufficient oversight of LDTs already through the CLIA process and through oversight with CMS. I think FDA's position has been, and certainly there is support from some sectors of the industry in what FDA is proposing that we'll talk about soon, I'm sure. But there has been support for more oversight by FDA because of the significant changes that have occurred in this industry over the past 25 or 30 years. I mean, in 1976, when the medical device amendments were passed, which originally gave FDA jurisdiction over devices, the type of laboratory developed tests that were being used 20 or 25 years ago, that industry is certainly very different from the industry we see today.
Well, what has changed to now make the FDA see it as something requiring its oversight?
Well, there have been, I think, a number of changes within the industry itself, and certainly both technological changes so that you see much more in the way of computer software being used in tests, much more high-tech instrumentation that's used in the not only in the development, but certainly in the analysis of these types of tests. And then even things like business models have changed. The advent of FedEx overnight delivery means that laboratories where in the past 20 or 25 years ago, you'd be talking about laboratories that were doing samples of patients that were really local, local community hospitals, local organizations where there was much more involvement at a local level of the physicians who were involved, the institutions that were involved, and today we see situations where you can have a single lab located anywhere in the United States or frankly even in the world that can really service customers from either all throughout the U.S. or in some instances even throughout the world. So the industry has changed significantly. And I think from the perspective of the FDA, that's necessitated changes in how they see oversight and regulation should occur.
I take it the way these tests are being used has also changed, where once upon a time they may have been used to diagnose a rare disease. Today, we're seeing a much more complex approach where in a world of personalized medicine, these tests are being used to really guide treatment decisions by doctors in terms of, say, someone who has a cancer to determine what drug is appropriate or other approaches. Has that had a big effect on the way FDA is thinking about their role?
I think very much so, and in the framework that FDA has published recently, back at the end of July, FDA talks a lot about taking a risk approach to oversight of the product, and talks about some of the concerns that you just mentioned, that in many ways the how LDTs are being used now are in much more of a clinical manner that have much more impact on the treatments that may be used, and in many ways, especially when we're talking about things that are tests that are evolved for cancer and other high risk diseases, where the risk to the patient should there be an inaccuracy in the test can be very high. So I think the idea that there's greater risk now because there is more reliance on these tests is another concern, and one of the reasons that FDA has stated that more oversight is needed now than in the past.
Well, the FDA has actually made overtures to regulate LDTs for some time, let's say at least going back to 2007. Why haven't these past efforts taken hold?
Well, you're right that this is, to the extent that many, including myself, have called this a sea change in terms of FDA's regulatory pathway for how these products are going to be treated with. I don't think there is anyone that should have been taken by surprise by what FDA published recently with respect to its framework. As you stated, FDA has taken this position publicly back in 2010 when they had a public meeting on development of LDTs and regulatory a regulatory framework, and even earlier than that, when members of FDA have publicly stated that they thought it was appropriate and necessary for FDA to change the manner in which that it had been regulating LDTs. Now, why it took from 2007 to 2014 to actually get FDA to publish a position that really laid out with some detail as to what they were going to do in the future. I think this is both a complicated area, and it's one where there are clearly differences of opinion. And you may be aware, I'm sure, that the House Subcommittee on Health recently had, I think 2 days ago on the 9th, a panel hearing on this issue, and there were entities that were taking the position that FDA did not have the legal authority to regulate LDTs in the manner that the framework lays out, and there were others who were quite supportive of it. So there are mixed opinions on whether FDA even has the legal ability to move forward with what they're doing. There are mixed opinions on whether FDA is taking the right approach, even if they do have the legal authority. So I think there hasn't been a real coalescence among that FDA has taken the right strategy. Moreover, in 2012, there was legislation that was passed under the Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act, which required FDA to notify Congress 60 days before it issued any draft guidance. And that's what necessitated what we saw at the end of July, which was a letter to both the House and the Senate laying out what FDA termed a framework rather than a draft guidance. So it was almost the pre-publication to Congress saying this is what we intend to do with LDTs. And I suspect that within the Congress itself, there are mixed opinions on whether FDA is taking the right approach here. So, FDA has laid down an initial marker as to what they intend to do, but I think there's a lot of stakeholders in this process, including the Congress itself, that are going to weigh in and ultimately have an impact on what FDA's regulatory framework is going to be for LDTs. So this is really the beginning of the story and not the end. And those complexities, I think, are why FDA really did this in a rather slow and deliberate manner.
Well, the agency has indicated it's not going to treat all LDTs equally. What's the approach the FDA is expected to take?
Well, I think there's two components of the approach that FDA is taking. The first, as I mentioned, is they are taking a so-called risk-based approach, which is similar to how FDA treats medical devices in general. And that's to say, based on a variety of risk factors, FDA will classify LDTs in the same way that they classify medical devices in general, which is to say that they will be classified in Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3, with Class 1 being the lowest risk devices and Class 3 being the highest risk of devices. FDA has said that the factors it will include whether the device is intended for use in high-risk diseases or conditions or patient populations, whether the device is used for screening or diagnosis, the nature of the clinical decision that will be made based on the test result, whether a physician or a pathologist would have other information about the patient to assist in making a clinical decision in addition to the LDT result, meaning is it the only thing they're going to be relying on, or is it one of several factors the clinician may be relying on, whether there are alternative diagnostic and treatment options available to the patient, and then the potential consequences or impact of erroneous results, if there was to be a problem with the device. So FDA has given us some sense of the risk factors that they're looking at. I think that's one area, where FDA has already indicated that within the next 2 years, within 24 months of a final guidance being published, that it will give additional guidance to industry on how it intends to classify LDTs within those Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 classifications. So I think it's an area that FDA recognizes it will engender many, many questions and for which they're going to need to give additional guidance. So first, there's that risk factor evaluation, and the second is there's going to be a fairly significant phase-in period. The guidance has many benchmarks in terms of timing because there are a number of new requirements that are going to be put in place, including requirements for notification to FDA, complying with medical device reporting, complying with the QSR, and complying with the adverse event notification. And those are going to be phased in to some extent, as well as pre-market submission, whether that's either a 510K or a PMA. And that's going to be phased in almost over a 9-year period. Some of them certainly sooner than others. But this is, a framework where we're talking about almost a decade in the making before we get to the end of what FDA has proposed. So there is a fairly substantial amount of implementation time, and I expect there's going to be some bumps along the way, and there's going to be some changes that may need to be made as policies are implemented.
And what are the implications for companies that have existing LDTs in use today? Will they have to do anything?
Well, in my notes about what the greatest effect of companies, I have $3 written down, and I think the biggest challenge for laboratories is really going to be what FDA is proposing are a significant amount of I don't want to use the term burdens in a completely negative sense, but there's going to be a significant amount of time and resources that companies who wish to continue to stay in this industry, there are going to be significant costs that are associated with companies in order to be able to comply with these new requirements.
Will existing tests be grandfathered, or are they going to have to go through some kind of a registration process? Or?
That's a great point, and one that is very clearly made to the extent that companies need to make pre-market submissions, and we haven't gotten into the details of this, but again, based on risk factors, there will be some devices that will be required to go through either the PMA or the 510K process, and there are time frames in which those submissions need to be made. But FDA's stated position is that so long as the submissions are made, those pre-market submissions are made within the time frames indicated, companies will be able to continue to keep products on the market while they're under review. So at least as proposed right now, there's no suggestion that any device or any LDTs that are currently being marketed will need to be withdrawn from the market. And I think that's important.
So in terms of companies that are in this field that are thinking strategically about their future, what are they going to have to do differently going forward?
Well, and I think the challenges are going to be there will be a large learning curve and that's going to be difficult. For example, let me use the quality system regulation as an example, the QSR requirements. Companies are currently required, of course, to comply with CLIA standards. But the QSR standards, the quality system regulation standards, are really meant to be applied to manufacturers of devices. And how the overlap of CLIA and the QSR are going to be handled by FDA and CMS is an issue that I think even the regulators at this point realize are not well defined. And it's going to be difficult for companies to begin determining what types of resources they need, what types of hires they need, whether they need consultants, when they know that there are new requirements that are going to be put in place at some point, but that those requirements aren't really very clear right now. So I think the difficulty is to begin planning for something for which you don't really understand. And thankfully, there is a fairly significant implementation time for many of these, but there's not a lot of good guidance right now. I'd say, with respect to the framework that FDA has published, it gives very broad strokes on what they intend to do, but doesn't provide a lot of clarity on many of these issues as to how they're actually going to be implemented. So I think companies are rightfully at this point should be asking a lot of questions. I think we're going to see a lot of comments from industry to FDA when the final guidance is published. And I think there needs to be a lot of education by FDA because, frankly, in an area where they have had very little oversight for a long time, I think even FDA would acknowledge that there may be a knowledge gap on their basis, on their point, as to how this industry actually operates, and I think they need to be receptive to being educated on issues which may be very important to the industry and which FDA doesn't have a lot of information yet. So I think there needs to be a flow of information both from FDA to the industry and industry to FDA on this issue. I think there's a lot to be learned from both sides.
Well, the FDA's timing probably could have been better. It comes as Congress is moving forward with efforts to advance the 21st Century Cures Initiative, which seems to bring with it some animosity towards regulation. What's the politics around this, even though both the 21st Century Cures Initiative and the FDA's efforts to regulate LDTs are framed around hastening an era of personalized medicine?
Well, I would say there's some skepticism. And again, talking about the Subcommittee on Health hearing that they had a couple days ago, I think it's worth, I'll just read two sentences from the statement of Chairman Pitts, who said, "It is indisputable that the draft guidance documents the agency recently released would fundamentally alter the regulatory landscape for the review and oversight of LDTs and the clinical labs that develop them. That fact alone has raised legitimate concerns about whether FDA can or should use guidance to promulgate a new regulatory approach." I think from that statement you can hear that there is some skepticism with FDA's approach here, and with the amount of visibility that this has gotten, I think it's clear that there is going to be a significant amount of input from Congress, and to the extent that Congress is involved, from the natural constituents that they're going to hear from. So again, I think FDA's framework that they've published to some extent is a starting point, but may not be exactly where we end up after the variety of stakeholders have their say here. And I think that includes Congress, and I think the 20th Century Cures Initiative is going to inject necessary balance to make sure that, yes, to the extent there should be more oversight, and I think FDA is the natural regulatory agency to do that, but to really balance the concerns of not stifling innovation while ensuring that there is appropriate regulatory oversight. So I think a balance will be struck. or needs to be struck. And I think this is an area with, significant enough visibility that there's going to be a variety of stakeholders who are going to weigh in on this issue very strongly and with opposing views. So, I think it's not yet clear what direction a number of entities are going to go. And, for example, the clinical laboratories who both submitted citizens petition to FDA suggesting that they did not have the legal authority to regulate LDTs. FDA rejected that argument and pressed ahead. They've continued to make that argument, and I think one issue will be, will they pursue a legal challenge, or are they going to try and spend their time trying to affect the process rather than derailing the process? And I think that's an issue that is not yet clear. So I think there's a couple of directions that could go still.
Nate Beaver, partner with Foley Lardner. Nate, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.